Hello and welcome to DEntremont. Tonight I want to do a follow-up video. This is pertaining to a video that I did recently with Mark over at Super Review. It was called the Blind Shootout Challenge or something like that. It was one of his pink noise videos, so if you want to go check that out. What he did is he sent me a few IEMs that he thought that I would like based on my preference for what I consider a linear frequency response. So he had a few he thought I'd like. He sent them over and we thought, hey, let's blindfold myself, and I put on a blindfold and fumbled around like a moron and gave my impressions of these few IEMs, and Mark and I talked and discussed it on the live chat. So tonight what I want to do is, I've actually had those IEMs that he's allowed me to have for way too long, but it's given me a really good opportunity to try each one for an extended period of time to really become familiar with the sound and to compare and contrast them with some of the favorite IEMs that I already have and with each other. So tonight I'm going to give you a quick review of those earphones, what I think about them, their value proposition, and then just kind of an overview compared to some of my favorite IEMs. So let's just jump right in. I'm not going to go too much into the design, the build, things like that. It's going to be primarily about the sound, but we can bring up a little bit. All right, so the first one we're going to do is we're going to do the Truthear Zero. The Truthear Zero is a dual dynamic IEM. It was tuned with the help of Crinacle, and I'm sure you're familiar with him and his frequency response graphs and whatnot. So he went with the sort of Harman target for this tuning. It is the Truthear X Crinacle Zero is the name of it. It's a $50 earphone. It has 2 dynamic drivers per ear. And what that allows is it allows the bass shelf to be a very specific curve, as well as the treble, that allows them to really attain a Harman tuning, really good Harman tuning. These things are very, very accurate Harman target. Now, they're plastic construction. They have a decent cable. Just overall basic quality. They're $50. That's what I'd expect. They're sort of a nice shell design. It's semi-molded, smooth, round. Nothing amazing looking, but it's not bad. It's a decent design. What I do like about them is they're lightweight and they're very comfortable. So I have no problem wearing these things for a long period of time. Now, in terms of the sound, they have sort of what I said, a Harman tuning. So to me, that equates to sort of a sucked out or a slightly hollow sounding midsection. And if you look at the bass on a graph, let's see if we can pull up the graph here, you'll see that the bass is a little bit more low and sub bass dominant and not as much mid bass dominant. So the treble has a similar sort of shelf where it's got a mid and upper treble boost, but the kind of mid section, let's say between 3 to 400 and let's say 1 to 2 kilohertz, is relatively taking a back seat to those bass and treble frequencies. And what that does, in my opinion, is it gives the sound sort of a carved out and more edgy and hollow sound to it. So when you have a song that has a lot of bass, the bass is very firm, very full. It doesn't sound overly thick and warm like it bleeds into the mid bass or anything like that. But the bass weight and the bass presence is definitely a little bit north of neutral, in my opinion. Same with the treble. It has a slightly nasal quality to it in some instances because of the extra low treble boost. And the curve of the treble is pretty good and pretty smooth. These have no objectionable peaks or dips or anything. So the overall response sounds smooth and high quality. In fact, if you weren't comparing these to any other IEMs, you can kind of adapt with your brain, and before you know it, they don't really sound particularly U-shaped, although I would say in a critical sense, they do have a slight U-shape to them because of those mids being kind of scooped out. So if you were to listen to a song, for instance, a song like Silly Love Songs by Paul McCartney, in the beginning, the percussive elements, the clanks and the clunks, they have a very metallic timbre. The dynamic driver does a very good job of being clear and smooth, but they do stand out a little bit, again, in that sort of a nasal congestion kind of area, just a little bit, so they sound a little bit less natural and liquid clear and a little bit more in your face in those frequencies that can kind of enhance the sense of energy, which makes a lot of instruments stand out a little bit, maybe jump out more at you. And that bass does the same thing with the bass instruments. It kind of makes the bass have a little bit more of a feeling of impact maybe and of dynamics. But again, you lose a little bit in the mids, so things in the mids are a little bit less smooth and a little bit less present. So the body of some instruments is a little bit lacking. Again, this is relative to earphones like the Kato and the Etymotic and things that I think have a little bit better curve. But nonetheless, it's not drastic compared to those earphones. It's still very good. And in fact, if you like the Harman target, which I do, I mean, the Harman target's okay. I think it nails the Harman target incredibly well, and it does a very good job of representing what a Harman earphone should sound like. Now, if you listen to certain songs that have strings and orchestra elements, oboes and flute and wind instruments can stand out incredibly precisely and have very good imaging, but the string sections sound maybe a little bit less lush and have a little bit more of a low bass and high sharpness quality to them, whereas the mids just take away from that nice, smooth, lush quality you'd have with like some Sordino strings or something like that. Same with pads and synth elements that have a lot of body to them. They just sound a little bit more thinner and a little bit more scooped out in the mids. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's really the best way to describe it. A lot of songs that have complex elements in the mix, like a lot of different instruments that have, I'd say, a dense or thick mix, these do an incredibly good job because that added bass and treble presence helps to kind of distinct and separate those instruments from each other and makes them very clear to hear. So even though I would argue they don't sound as natural and transparent in a sense, they sound very easy to hear into the mix and pick out instruments clearly. So that's a very good bonus. Now, one thing I think these excel at, and this is something that is probably good for a lot of people nowadays, is it excels at enhancing the sense of energy in a song. And I think that's why the Harman target is so popular among a lot of listeners, is because unfortunately, this isn't a criticism of the music itself, but most music in the last 20 years has been horrifically compressed in terms of dynamics. The dynamic brick wall compression has just gotten out of hand. It's slightly improved in recent times, but between the late 90s to the more recent years, they had something called the loudness wars, which maybe I'll do a video on that later, and songs just got progressively louder and the dynamics were just squished out of them, so they can sound kind of dull. And one of the tricks that mastering engineers will actually do is they'll sometimes add a little bit of an EQ on the bass and treble end to try to re-energize that sound a little bit, but there's only so much you can do because you're working with a very limited range of dynamics. So once that song is kind of flattened and compressed like that, it can come off sounding dull, and just not a lot of dynamic transients to kind of excite you. So a lot of music is like that. Even songs that should be energetic and dynamic, comparatively, if you were to listen to a well-mastered version of it, you'd say, wow, that does sound kind of dull and lifeless. So an earphone like the Truthear X Crinacle Zero, what it does is it kind of brings out a little bit of that treble energy and that bass energy to give you a little bit of oomph and a little bit of sharpness, and it just kind of re-energizes a lot of those songs. So for a plethora of different genres out there in the last 10, 20 years, that sort of sound signature catered towards the Harman signature does a really good job of making modern music sound pretty good. And that's not a bad thing. Now, I still prefer a more neutral earphone because it's a little bit more realistic and revealing of what the source material is mixed like, but nonetheless, I see why it could be a very appealing signature to some people. Now, I will say that even though it's not a drastic difference, even when I'm not comparing it and I'm just listening to music for an hour or so, I do notice the sucked out mids a little bit, and in some songs it's more noticeable than others, but I'd say that they're very smooth and they're very technically proficient. I don't hear any real lack of imaging precision or just technical performance. There's no noise, there's no hiss, there's no objectionable peaks or dips, so they're a very good earphone, and for $50, I'd say honestly they're really good value. So that is the Truthear X Crinacle Zero. I highly recommend that one. That's a good set. Now let's go on to the next set. The next IEM I want to talk about is the Dunu Vulkan, or the Dunu Vulkan DKX6. This is a hybrid 6-driver IEM. It has a surround driver, as they call it, a titanium-coated dynamic driver for the bass, and 4 Knowles-balanced armatures for the mids and treble. This is a $380 IEM, and it's a metal IEM. The design is very nice. It looks practically identical to the Dunu EST112, the body shell design, only it has more of an etched design on the outer part instead of the smooth design of the EST112. But it looks like it's essentially the same CNC aluminum shell or whatever. It's very comfortable. I find them a little bit weighty. They're metal, but they feel durable. But they fit in the ear well. I don't have any problems wearing them. The cable, I like the Dunu cables. They always make a nice cable. with nice materials and a nice right angle terminated end that you can mix match with different types of connectors if you want a balanced or a 3.5 or whatever. So it's a good package. Now this IEM is interesting. It's interesting in that it's a little bit less, I would say, neutral than the other IEMs in these comparisons that I'm doing. In fact, I'm going to pull up a graph here because I'm not prepared. I should have had this already done here. But the Vulkan is a little bit funky in the treble. And what I mean by funky in the treble is a lot of these earphones that we're comparing right now have a very smooth, very linear treble. The Vulkan has sort of a peak at around 1.5 kilohertz or so, and then it kind of dips down and it has another peak about maybe somewhere between 7 and 9 kilohertz. Then it has a pretty big dip, and then it has another bump up high at like 15, 16 kilohertz. So it's kind of just up and down a little bit. The bass response is very, very good. In fact, I'd say that of all the earphones, it's one of the better bass responses, and it sounds as such. The dynamic driver does an excellent job. I don't hear any problem with coherency, and what I mean by that is I don't hear any obvious distinction between drivers. I don't say, oh, I can hear that the bass starts there, and oh, yeah, the mids are there. No, it sounds like a cohesive, unified sound from low to end, from low to high. I think that it does have a slight balanced armature timbre in the treble, but I'll be honest, it's not that great. In fact, when I was first getting my impressions of them, I didn't really notice it. Only in extended listening, when I became more familiar with them, did I start to kind of hear the textural differences upon really close comparisons. But it's a very good set. And what I think is interesting about the treble, and this is something I've seen in other Dunus like the EST-112, I'm not sure if the dips in the treble are selectively chosen and to enhance the frequency response in some way, but what their earphones tend to do, like the 112, is kind of give an enhanced soundstage. And when I use the word soundstage, I hate audiophile terms, but the soundstage, in my opinion, is the impression that the space you're listening to is large, like a spacious room, for instance, and that you can hear into the depths of that space. That's soundstage. Now, a trick that and I call it a trick because it's something that you can do when you're mixing music in a digital audio workstation, is that you can lower some of the frequencies in the treble so that the surrounding frequencies give sort of an enhanced sense of depth. So for instance, you could have a little bit extra low treble, like 1 to 2 kilohertz, a little bit of a dip, and then a little bit extra high treble, like about the 10 kilohertz and above. And what that does is it kind of gives a scooped out quality that makes the spaciousness sound almost larger than life. If you overdo it, it can sound unnatural, but Dunu has a very good way of tuning their IEMs where they have just enough of a dip there that it kind of enhances the spaciousness and the imaging. Now, for me personally, in a very critical sense, when I listen to certain instruments and certain songs I'm very familiar with, I can see that it's not as natural and as neutral of a quality. It doesn't sound completely believable, but it does have a nice enhanced soundstage. So it's almost like if you were sharpening a photograph. You know, it may not be the original raw photograph, you've sharpened it, but sometimes that sharpening can enhance it in a way that is, you know, pleasurable. So I think the Dunu Vulkan does that. I think it has a very good tuning, very reminiscent of something like the EST-112, although the bass is a much better response. It has a nice upward sloping into the sub-bass region response. I think that the timbre of the overall earphone is very good considering it's a multi-driver and it has balanced armatures in it. I'm actually surprised that it has more cohesive sound than I would expect, having that many drivers and having balanced armatures. So they did a very good job with that. I would say of all the earphones that I have in the set, it's kind of probably tied with the Truthear Zero, because I think the Truthear Zero is a little bit less of my desired target, but it also hits that target with a little bit more of a smooth response. This kind of aims closer to my dentReviews target or something like the Moondrop target, but it has that slight, you know, trick or whatever you want to call it in the treble that kind of throws it off a little bit, and there's a little bit of unevenness in the treble as well. The unevenness in the treble for me eliminates that unbelievable and just purely utter silky smooth quality to the treble, and instead gives it a little bit more of a perhaps a spacious sound, but at the cost of that liquid silky smooth quality. And I really value that. And some of the earphones that I think have that are the Moondrop Kato is pretty liquidy smooth. The Etymotic ER4 series is very liquidy smooth. Things like that, where they have a nice lower treble emphasis and they have a smooth roll off into the upper treble. That makes it just super smooth and clear. You can hear distinction and precision, but you also have like the treble body, for lack of better words, and the treble thickness is natural and creamy. So every nuance is heard across the treble frequencies. With something like the Dunu Vulkan, it has very good detail retrieval for sure, and that upper energy in the treble can increase the sense of sharpness, but like a photograph, it may not actually be improving the retrieval of details, but just enhancing certain details to make it appear sharper. I feel like that's a good analogy to the Vulkan. I think it gives the sound the appearance of being a sharper, maybe wider and clearer sound, but at the cost of the, utter perfection in terms of neutrality and that liquid smooth treble that I like. So overall, I'd say it's maybe a little bit on the drier side in terms of the texture and the timbre, and it definitely has just a little bit of that balanced armature quality to it, which, if you're familiar with my opinion on balanced armatures, there are some that are great. In fact, I love the ER4, but I do not prefer it to dynamic drivers. I much prefer dynamic drivers and planar drivers to a balanced armature in terms of their texture or their timbre. So beside those aspects, it's a very high quality earphone. It has a lot of things going for it with the build, the design, and the sound. And if you know the signature that you're looking for, if you like something like the EST112, it sounds like an EST112 with a little bit less mid-bass warmth. I think the EST112, if my memory serves me well, came across as a little bit more resolving and high definition in the treble for me, and I really like it. I think I liked it more than this in that regard, but I did find that it was a little bit overly warm, but it had a quality to it that really kept the warmth from being a negative, and it made everything that you listen to very relaxing and easy to listen to. So this is similar in the overall response, but just a little bit leaner bass, a little bit more low bass dominant and not as much mid bass dominant. So that's the Dunu Vulkan. I'll kind of stop there, and I don't want to go into it, sounding like a broken record. So that is the Dunu Vulkan. I think it is a little overpriced, and I say that because the IEM market is incredibly competitive right now. And even these earphones that I'm comparing it to are just strikingly good earphones, and they're a lot less expensive. Now, does that mean that the Dunu is not worth it? Not necessarily. It feels incredibly well built. I think Dunu has a reputation of making well-built IEMs. The frequency response is unique in its kind of design, so if that's something that you like, that might be something that really just does it for you. You like that extra spaciousness of the treble and that texture and the bass response. It's a very good response. And if you don't have any problem with balanced armature timbre, you may even like balanced armature timbre. Balanced armature timbre. Not to get too far into it, but the balanced armature timbre is a negative for me. However, I will absolutely agree that the balanced armature speed and the quality that it has compared to a dynamic driver can easily give it a sense of a higher definition precision without being brighter. And what I mean by that is if you had identical earphones with identical frequency responses, I think the balanced armature would sound a little bit thinner and brighter and clearer in comparison because of the transient speed and just the technical qualities of the balanced armature. So it can give a very high definition experience, and if you're not comparing it directly to a dynamic driver, you may have no problem whatsoever with the texture. For me personally, I noticed that, and compared to a dynamic driver, the dynamic driver just comes off as sounding more natural to me, and I prefer that, even at the cost of maybe a lack of high definition quality. It would kind of be like comparing a television that has, an OLED screen with the utmost color accuracy and contrast, and it's just like a flawless image, and then maybe you have a TV that's 3D, and oh, that's awesome. It enhances the imaging and all that stuff, but maybe the colors aren't as wide of a spectrum, and it doesn't have perfect blacks, so the overall quality is maybe not as good, but yet it still gives that enhanced sense of depth and 3D-ness. It's a weird analogy, but my point is just that the treble can give a sense of a very high-definition resolution while at the cost of being maybe a little bit less natural sounding. So that is the Dunu Vulkan. It is what it is. I think it's a little bit overpriced, but I think it's a good quality IEM, and if you like that target, go for it. All right, the next IEM I want to review is the ThieAudio Legacy 2. This is a $100 dual driver IEM. It is a hybrid with a 10mm beryllium dynamic driver for the bass and a Knowles balanced armature driver for the mids and the treble. It has a acrylic plastic style shell. It's sort of a semi-custom design shape to fit your ear comfortably. It's very lightweight in plastic, and it's very, very attractive. It has a nice translucent blue shell that lets you see into the components a little bit. I like that a lot. Because it's so lightweight, it seals well and it holds in your ear very easily, and it can be used for hours on end, and I have no comfort issues whatsoever myself. It's got a nice removable cable. I failed to mention a lot of the IEMs that I've reviewed here have removable cables as well, most of them 2-pin cables. This is one that is very nicely designed. It's a decent sheathing, and it's got small components on it. So the straight angle connector at the end, 3.5 connector, is very slim, would fit a lot of phone cases and things like that. Just a good design overall. So how does it sound? Well, the Legacy 2 is actually surprisingly one of the closest frequency response to my dentReviews target that I've ever seen. In fact, if you look at the bass response up to the high treble response, it's very, very linear and very, very smooth. There are no dips or peaks until about 14 to 16 kilohertz. There's a noticeable dip, which frankly is pretty much common in most IEMs. It's very, very rare that I see a very linear treble extension that high up, and even if I do, there's usually a flaw somewhere else. On top of that, most people that do these kind of reviews and measurements would agree that past 10 kilohertz, the measurements are a little bit harder to gauge, a little bit harder to know that you're getting consistent results. But so far from my listening, they seem to match pretty closely to what I hear. So the only real negative in the frequency response is that upper treble dip. But that's a pretty minor area, and it's pretty high up, so it's not very obvious. It's kind of negligible. The bass response is phenomenal. It has a very nice, gradually upward sloping curve towards the sub-bass. There's no mid-bass bloat. The treble is very smooth. There's no dips or peaks all the way up to the upper treble. It has a very nice shape and, again, meets my target very, very well. So how does it sound? Well, I'd say the sound goes along with that frequency response pretty well. The only objection I have to the sound is that compared to a lot of the IEMs that I like the Elixir, the Kato, things like that, it does have a more noticeable balanced armature timbre. The textural quality of the treble and the overall sound is just not as natural as the dynamic drivers that I like. Now, if I'm not comparing them side by side, it's not an obvious difference. The main trait that it has that I believe is caused by that is that the overall quality and sound of the Legacy 2 is a little bit on the softer side. And what I mean by that is the bass is very good. It's a phenomenal bass response. It hits very deep and impactful when it's necessary and gets out of the way when it's necessary. But the treble just lacks a lot of transient energy. It's not that it's dull. Don't misunderstand me. It's a phenomenal sounding earphone. It's one of the better earphones I've ever heard. It's very good response, very clear, very natural in its overall presentation. However, comparatively, being critical and comparing it to like a dynamic driver that I like, the treble just sounds a little bit soft. Now, as I said previously, balanced armatures can sometimes give you the impression of maybe more of a high resolution sound while not being as maybe energetic and strident as a dynamic driver might be. And I think that that's the most obvious in this Legacy 2 treble. It's not that it's bad. It sounds superb. It sounds clean. It sounds clear. It just doesn't sound as natural, and it doesn't have as much of a bite in it when necessary compared to something like the dynamic Kato or Elixir. So if you like a soft quality, that's actually a good thing. If you're familiar with the EST-112, it kind of shared a similar quality. I think the EST-112 was a little bit more incisive in the treble, but it shared the quality that you could listen to pretty much any music and it would render it with ease, and nothing would really sound strident or objectionable. Now, if the mix is bad, yes, it will show that, but it's not going to be as aggressive in revealing the flaws as something like the Kato or the Elixir. So that might be a trait that some people like because it allows you to have an easy listening experience with any music. And yes, it's on the leaner, more neutral side, so it's maybe not going to be as warm and smooth as some IEMs, but for its response and the balance between low, mids, and high, it has a soft, kind of a gentle presentation, which I like. It is very nice, but I definitely prefer the transient quality, the textural quality of the dynamic drivers. And I know that sounds like a broken record. I say that about a lot of IEMs, but I'm just trying to stress the slight differences because I think they do matter. I think if you are someone who's familiar with balanced armatures and you like them, this is absolutely phenomenal. This is one of the best sets I've ever heard. I really think it sounds incredible, and with the right tips and the right response in your ear with your resonance peaks, this can just be an almost perfect frequency response. But that softness can kind of skew the subjective perception of the frequency response. In other words, compared to the Elixir, for instance, even though the responses are very similar on graph, the treble is different in that the Elixir actually has a little bit more of a dip here and there, but the Elixir to me sounds a little bit clearer and more precise in the treble and less soft, has a little bit more energy when needed. And the Elixir also sounds a little bit more firm in the bass. Now, it's not to say that the Legacy 2 doesn't have a firm bass. It has a nice deep focus bass response that hits really well when needed. But because the overall sound of the entire tonality is a little bit more on the soft side, it comes across sounding maybe a little bit softer, maybe a little bit warmer, even though it has a very linear response. So for the price, it has a great sound, it has a great design, it's very comfortable, it's very lightweight. I think it's an awesome value, I really do. So I won't get too much more into it because I'll go into some comparisons between all the models afterwards, but needless to say, that is my impressions of the Legacy 2. Okay, the last IEM I want to talk about is the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. If I'm not mistaken, this is another collaboration with Crinacle, and this is a very interesting IEM. This is a $25 IEM. If you go to linsol.com, it is an incredibly cheap IEM. It is a 10mm single dynamic driver. It's made in a plastic housing, and it's got a pretty basic cable. It is still a removable 2-pin cable, which is absurd. $25 won't even get you a decent 2-pin cable half the time. So you're getting a decent cable and an IEM. That's pretty impressive. The shell does have a lot of 90-degree kind of right angles on it, and depending on how you fit it in your ear, those can sometimes press against your outer ear and they can become pretty uncomfortable. Now, for me personally, as long as I fit it at the right angle, those don't touch my ear and it's perfectly comfortable. It's very lightweight and it seats well, so I have no problem. But I do have to be careful. If I just have it twisted just a little bit wrong, I'll feel those protrusions in my ear and it can become pretty uncomfortable pretty fast. So, how does this thing sound? Again, a single dynamic driver, 10mm, $25. Well, my mind has been blown because I was frankly incredibly impressed with the Moondrop Chew and a couple other earphones in a similar price bracket. But the Salnotes 7 Hz Salnotes, the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero, what a weird name, is very, very linear. It's not perfect. No IEM has been yet, but it has an incredibly smooth response. Now, there's some caveats to that. The original ear tips that come with it, for me personally, didn't sit as deep as they should in the sense that they felt a little bit unnatural if I pushed them in too deep. So for a while, I was listening to them and getting the impression that they were a little bit grainy and maybe a little bit lean. Not much, but just a little bit compared to something like the Moondrop Kato. But then after measuring them and measuring them with my favorite SpinFit CP100 tips, I saw that the treble was a little bit smoother on the CP100, but the bass and everything else was exactly the same. But when I started to wear those tips, I found that they seemed to seal a little bit better and a little bit deeper than the stock tips did for my ears. So I got a much better response, a little bit fuller on the low end and smoother in the treble. And when I did that, the treble was strikingly similar to the Moondrop Kato with the SpinFit tips. In fact, if you look at the graph here, they measure practically identically, minus a little bit of a different wiggle in the treble. One has a little bit of a bump here, one has a little bit of a bump there, but essentially they're incredibly similar. The main difference in the tonal balance is that the Kato has just ever so slightly more mid-bass. Now, I actually prefer the treble and the, I'd say the quality of the driver of the Kato, but I prefer the frequency response of the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. Now, I've listened to the Salnotes Zero a lot in the last few days, and I'm kind of wondering if the impression I have of the Kato being superior technically is one of actual technical improvements, or if it's actually an expectation bias. And what I mean by that is, I think that the Moondrop Kato is a more expensive IEM and is touted to have a very high quality dynamic driver. The Salnotes Zero is $25. Well, if I'm listening to the Kato thinking this is a better driver, it's more expensive, I sincerely believe that our brains are very easy to trick, and we might be listening for that increased quality that we think is there, and therefore we perceive it. And if you're not familiar with expectation bias and the different placebo type effects that you can have with audio in your brain, you should check out some videos. I'll probably have to make some soon on that topic, but it's very, very difficult sometimes to remove all of that bias from your listening. So I have to admit that when I listen to these and the different testing that I do, sometimes I can't tell the difference between them, other than the fact that the Kato is a little bit warmer and smoother because of the mid bass and the treble kind of response, and the Zero is a little bit more lean and maybe energetic sounding in the treble. But again, comparatively, I think I'm hearing that the Zero is a little bit more narrow in its imaging, in its width, and it's a little more sharp in its treble, but maybe not necessarily in a high quality way. It's just the frequency response and the dynamic driver that it has just gives it a little bit of a sharpness, kind of like sharpening a photo, like I was talking about earlier, where it may not be natural. It may just be an enhanced kind of sharpness. I can't tell, though. It might be natural. It's very, very close to the Kato. Very, very close. The bass is the biggest difference in that it just has a little bit better of a bass response and sounds a little bit leaner and more linear to my ears. Now, the Kato, the way I would describe it is the treble to me on the Kato sounds a little bit more laid back, ever so slightly, but it also sounds a little bit more spacious in that maybe the positioning of the images, of the instruments, I should say, are a little bit more easy to hear into. Maybe because it's laid back, maybe it's because it's a higher quality driver, I don't know. Whereas the Salnotes Zero instruments are very, very clear, but they maybe sound like a little bit more congested. However, they sound sharper, so I might perceive a little bit more detail in a stringed instrument. I might hear the bowing and the finer details more on the Zero than I would on the Kato even, and yet that instrument might sound very two-dimensional, where on the Kato it might have a little bit more of a wide sound to it, a little bit more of a spacious sound to it. But again, the differences are so incredibly minute. I would not be surprised if someone told me they were the same driver. I really wouldn't. I would think, oh, okay, I must have just been hearing something. Or maybe there's an ever so slightly different sound because of the plastic housing versus the metal housing. Maybe there's a little bit more resonance through the housing somehow. I don't know. But I honestly feel like, if I had to be completely honest, if you were to EQ the mid bass to be the same on these two IEMs, I probably wouldn't know which one I was listening to if I could sincerely do a double blind test somehow. I feel like they're that close. They really are. And the Salnotes Zero is 10 times less expensive than the Kato. That is freaking insane. So, of all these IEMs that we've talked about tonight, by far the Zero, the Salnotes Zero specifically, is the best value in my opinion. It's possibly the best value of any IEM I've ever seen, and it's one of the best IEMs I've ever heard. And, some people will say, DEntremont, he's an idiot. Like, how could he say that $25 earphone is as good as a $300 earphone or $200 earphone? And, y'all, your reputation's on that. I don't really care. I hear what I hear. I tell you how it is. I think that IEM sounds phenomenal. And if you have a low budget and you're concerned that you don't want to get a cheap IEM because, the Kato is just going to be that much better, don't waste your time or your money. Just buy the Zero, because I'm telling you, it is so close. Now, if you have an opportunity to hear them both, maybe you'll prefer the Kato for its slightly warmer sound, maybe just a little bit more relaxing in its quality, just a little bit. But when I say a little bit, I'm talking less of a difference than switching between an Etymotic ER4S and an Etymotic ER4SR, which are practically the same earphone. To me, I hear less of a difference. There is such a slight variation in the technical and sonic performance of the IEM that the only real difference I hear is that slight deviation in frequency response. But it's so slight that it really doesn't alter the sound too much. I do prefer the Zero in terms of frequency response. But again, I think the Kato might be a little bit better in technical performance, but in the realm of single-digit percentages. So, I'm going to leave it there, and that's going to conclude my Salnotes Zero review. And then the next phase here, we're going to just compare them to each other and to some of my favorite IEMs. So let's do that. All right, but first let me kind of go into how I compared these IEMs. Let me start by saying thank you to Mark because he let me borrow these for far too long. So I do appreciate that. But what it did allow me to do is it allowed me to have a lot of time with each IEM on its own. So I would take each IEM and listen to it for a week or two with no other IEMs to really familiarize myself with the sound. And then after that, I would basically do a few different types of comparisons. I would do a quick listening comparison where I would take one of my reference IEMs like the Kato or the Elixir that I'm very familiar with, and sometimes other earphones as well, depending on the situation. And I have a system where I place them where I can do a quick comparison, which maybe I'll show you that in another video. But I have them ready to compare very quickly, and I play sections of songs. I have a whole playlist of test music that I've put together where certain songs have certain characteristics that I listen for. And I'm switching back and forth kind of quickly in small chunks of the song, maybe even seconds sometimes, to compare and contrast the characteristics that I'm listening for in that song. The next method would be I listen to a single song with one IEM all the way through, and then I switch to another IEM and I listen to the same song again as closely volume matched as I can. And that gives me kind of a general perception of how the song feels in isolation. And then again, I just listen to them on their own for a week or two. So those three kind of comparisons are how I approach things. Now, I've spent a long time kind of procuring this test playlist, and I have things from low bass response to textural qualities to transient attack to lush orchestral mid frequencies to spatial imaging and depth and timbre, all these different things. And I listen to that song, one of the many songs, and I listen for that characteristic. So that's my process. So let me jump into these earphones and compare them to the reference sets that I mentioned, the Kato and the Elixir. We'll start with the Dunu Vulkan. The Dunu Vulkan, being the most expensive, is surprisingly probably my least favorite. It's a very good IEM, as I said, in my little mini review there. But compared to the Kato and the Elixir, two things stand out to me. One, I know I sound like a broken record, but the timbre, the balanced armature quality of the treble, it's just not as good as the Kato and the Elixir. It's not as obvious as some IEMs that are balanced armatures in my experience, but it just doesn't hold up against them in a direct comparison, and that's pretty obvious to me. Now, in isolation, it's not obvious. I feel like it's actually one of the more dynamic driver sounding IEMs, given that it's not. Maybe that's because of the quantity of balanced armatures and how they isolate each frequency. I don't know. Needless to say, I find the Vulkan is a little bit less texturally realistic. It doesn't have as much of a natural quality to it. As I said in the mini review, the treble has an interesting shape that kind of lends itself to an enhanced soundstage. Compared to the Kato and the Elixir, it does sound a little bit more maybe incisive in some aspects, but it does sound scooped out also, and the texture of the treble sounds a little bit more dry and a little bit more dark in a sense. Even though it's kind of a brighter, leaner response, it just comes across as maybe softer and more laid back in the treble than the Kato and the Elixir, which both have a little bit more of that dynamic treble transient quality that I like. The bass of the Vulkan is superb. And to give you an example of some songs, if I was listening to the Silly Love song by Paul McCartney, the metallic clanking and clonking, this is going to be really hard to describe, but there's different aspects of that metallic sound that I listen for. When you hear the metal clanking, there's the initial transient spike, and that spike needs to sound like real metal in a real room, have a natural quality to it. The strike of the transients on the Vulkan are almost exaggerated, where on the Kato and even specifically on the Elixir the transient sounds the most natural and the most proper amount of dynamics to it to sound real. And then the next thing that I listen for is the shape of the metal, and it's a very hard thing to describe, but when a metal instrument or drum or whatever it is that the clanks that they're hitting, when he hits that, there's sort of a transient for the spike of the instant hit, followed by the resonance of the metallic body of the object that is hit. It has sort of like a shape to it, almost like you're hearing the metallic object's low to high body. And the Elixir portrays that as very smooth and in a natural shape. The Kato portrays it a little less so, but very, very similar. The Vulkan portrays that in a more skewed sense to me. It sounds like that metallic object is just not as smooth, like maybe it's a different shape or it's rougher, and it comes off sounding less natural to me. So even though it might enhance the positional kind of space that you hear, the instruments themselves just sound less natural. Another example would be a song like Never Let Her Go by David Gates. The precision of the drums sounds very, very tight and accurate on the Vulkan, but the quality of the instrument, the body and the texture and the nuances of the instrument don't sound as cohesive and realistic as they do on, in this case, the Kato, I think, sounds the best on that song. The drums are very precise. It has just the right amount of air, and the drums sound like a drum in the room with you as you would be listening to someone play live. Whereas on the Vulkan, it sounds very good, and comparatively it's very, very close to that, but it just has a slightly less even tonal balance in that treble. So the shakers and the hi-hats maybe sound a little bit more dry and a little bit more crisp, almost in an overly crisp kind of way. And the textural quality of the snare drum maybe sounds a little more transient based and a little less nasal quality. And in this case, I use nasal as a good thing because the snare has a ring to it, and that ring is a certain frequency response. Let's just call it a nasally ring. The Vulkan doesn't portray it as nasally as it does transient, like high transient. So it can give a nice sharp attack, but it doesn't sound as natural and as realistic of a ring. And then bass-wise, they're very similar. The Vulkan has a very good bass shape. I even think the bass shape might be better than the Kato, but it comes off sounding a little bit softer in its bass attack than the Kato to me. The Kato sounds softer in the sense that it has more warmth, but the actual bass impact and how the bass notes strike sounds a little bit firmer on the Kato to me, whereas on the Dunu Vulkan, it does sound more sub-bass dominant and less mid-bass focused, so it's hard to describe it. In a sense, it sounds more impactful in that way, and yet still, there's a tactility, a firmness to the sound on the Kato that I don't think that the Vulkan hits as well. That might be due to the fact that the treble response and the transients of the treble, they're part of the bass. When you have a bass guitar, there are treble components to that. And maybe that those Vulkan transients and things are different, so as a cohesive bass instrument, maybe it's just not as convincing to me. I don't know. But that's the Vulkan. Let's jump over to the next one would be the Legacy 2. The ThieAudio Legacy 2 at $100. This is a similar comparison to the Vulkan in that it has a balanced armature timbre. I think it's more noticeable than the Vulkan in its balanced armatureness. I think that the frequency response is phenomenal. It is a superb frequency response, and as such, when you're listening to a lot of very good reference music, the frequency response is very apparently neutral. I mean, the bass response is superb. The bass driver in the Legacy 2 is excellent. It hits very deep and very precise. Again, I think the firmness and impact may not be as convincing as the Kato or the Elixir because the transients and the timbre of the balanced armature just don't lend itself to that full cohesive bass impact, as I was saying with the Vulkan. But I do think it's better than the Vulkan in that regard. I think the biggest thing, as I said, is it's kind of soft. So when we go back to the David Gates song, listening to Never Let Her Go by David Gates, the percussive elements on the Kato and the Elixir, for instance, they stand out as very incisive. They jump out at you. The shaker jumps out at, or the hi-hat jumps out at you, especially the metallic ride and things like that. They just kind of like jump out at you. Where on the Legacy 2, they sound a little bit like softer. They're very, very clear, and they're very, very neutral sounding in their tonal quality, but they just don't have as much of a dynamic tactility to it in the treble. It's, again, a very minor difference, but it does matter to me, and I feel like it detracts a little bit from my enjoyment of how a song can sometimes sound so transparent that it just takes me away to that recording space that I'm listening to. It takes that away a little bit, but it's also so good in the frequency response that it makes up for a lot of that, because it really does have a transparency in response that allows instruments to very easily be distinguished from each other in that frequency field. So the bass guitars are very distinctly bass guitars. The percussive elements are very distinctly percussive elements. The strings are very distinctly string elements, and it allows you to hear them all in their own carved out spaces, and they sound great. But when you analyze the critical texture of things, it kind of just falls apart a little bit. So I think when you listen to something like the BT, Suddenly from These Hopeful Machines, that song has a lot of treble transients, which makes that a little bit more apparent. Although it does showcase the superb bass of the Legacy 2. It's a great bass. But it's a great example of how it allows you to hear all the nuances and all the synth elements, the percussion, the bass, and all of that spread across the spectrum very smoothly and balanced, while still coming across a little bit soft and less transient focused. Now, I won't go too much further into that. I'm probably sounding like a broken record, but the balanced armature, I think, just lends itself to a more high resolution sound that gives you the imaging and the precision of the sound, but without the firm tactility of the dynamic driver. That's how I perceive the difference. So the next online is the Truthear X Crinacle. This one is interesting because it's two dynamic drivers. It has a very similar timbre quality to the dynamics that I like, the Kato and the Elixir, but the frequency response, as I said, is a little bit U-shaped, a little bit scooped out in the mids, a little bit maybe bass dominant and nasally in the trebles. Again, very slight descriptors, but those are the traits that I would compare. Now, compared to the Elixir and the Kato, when we go back to the song like David Gates' Never Let Her Go, in that case, the snare drum would actually be overly pronounced. The ringing of the snare drum is a little bit more nasally and a little bit more jump out at you, which again can give a sense of extra energy. And the percussive elements are very, very clear and very distinct. So distinct, in fact, that they almost sound a little bit unnatural, just a slight bit, but they're very, very clear and they jump out very, very precisely. Now, in that particular song, the lush strings come in after the intro, and they just sound a little bit more dry, a little bit more thin, not drastically, but just a little bit. And the bass, I would say, in the Truthear is a little bit more dominant in the mix. And, you know, you could argue, well, maybe it's mixed this way, that way, whatever. But even without hearing it on studio monitor speakers in a treated room, I feel like you can still tell just in any of these headphones that there's a certain level of bass balance between the bass and the rest of the instruments in this song. And the Truthear makes it pretty obvious that those bass elements are a little bit elevated. It sounds a little bit bass dominant, I would say, in the mix, which is not bad. It has a nice quality to it, but it just sounds a little bit less like that was the intention of the mix personally, just from my experience. It sounds like they're exaggerating that. Now, it does it in a very low and sub-bass isolated region, so it doesn't sound overly boomy or overly muddy, but it does sound overly full in its bass response. Now, if you were to take something like the Silly Love Songs by Paul McCartney again, or the IGY by Donald Fagen, the transient attack of the Truthear is much more pronounced, and the elements stand out so much clearer. In fact, I think that in some situations, it is very nice because it's like an enhancement. It's like it's a 3D effect that you add to the sound, which I like. But upon further listening and upon knowledge of the mix of a song, there are elements in the song that kind of take a back seat to those nice enhanced treble transients. And in the overall scope of listening, I don't like that because, you know, those elements aren't supposed to take a back seat. They're supposed to sound balanced and cohesive in the mix. So for me personally, even though it's a slight difference, that scooped out midsection does detract from the overall balanced sound for me, and it's a little bit too much. Now last, let's go to the Salnotes Zero, $25 single dynamic, and this thing is just phenomenal. I mean, the frequency response is like idiotically good for the price. Now, comparatively, if I was to take a song like Dan Fogelberg, the Make Love Stay, I compared that. If you listen to the transients in that, the transient attack compared to something like the Kato, which is also a single dynamic driver, they sound a little bit more strong on the Salnotes Zero. Just a touch. I mean, ever so slightly more. I don't know if the strident is the right word, but it feels like when you're listening to the guitars and the percussion and specifically the vocals on the Salnotes Zero, they all have this sort of edge to them. So if the vocal had like a shape, and this is a really bizarre way to describe it, but say the vocal comes out of the mix with a roundness to it, I think that the Salnotes Zero, the vocal comes out of the mix with a little bit more of a sharp shape to it, and it gives it a little bit more of a precise and tactile sense to it, while also sounding a little bit more bright and more dry in its quality. But relative to the Kato, it's practically the same in its overall presentation and frequency balance. The main difference, again, is the low kind of mids or the upper mid bass. And the Salnotes Zero is a little bit leaner in that area, which I like, which gives it a more sub-bass dominant kind of focus. The Salnotes Zero, I've said in the mini review, kind of sounds like it may not have the same imaging quality as the Kato or the Elixir, but again, I don't know if that's a perception based on my expectation of the sound or if that's actually a real quality of the driver. But the way I would describe it would be if I was listening to a song such as, let's say, David Benoit, Every Step of the Way. It has a lot of brush and hi-hat work, and it's kind of like all over the place on the drum set. It's very wide. The Elixir and the Kato sound very natural, smooth and clear, without really being overly dry or bright, but just they sound good. And it's a pretty thin, like 80s recording. I consider it neutral and very referenced, but it's lean compared to most modern music. So the brushes might sound bright in general, but those two represent it very smoothly and clinically and cleanly. The Salnotes Zero gives a little bit more energy in that brushes and the hi-hats, and they sound a little bit maybe a drier texture, less metallic and smooth and more dry in texture, but the difference is so infinitesimally small that it's nowhere near the difference between all these other IEMs that we're talking about. Those are drastically different in comparison to the difference between the Salnotes Zero and the Kato and the treble. The main difference I hear is that they just sound a little bit leaner and a little bit brighter because of that difference in the bass curve. But with the CP100 tips on the Kato and the Salnotes Zero, it really kind of brings those two together to the point where they're almost indistinguishable from each other if you're not a very careful listener. Another song that would be a good comparison would be listening to the Ori Will of the Wisp soundtrack. Some of the songs, like the final track of the album, has a string section after there are some very nice oboes and then a little bit of a swelling of the strings. There's this lush string part that just kind of swells and ebbs and flows, and it has just a really nice, gorgeous sound to it. When I listen to that on the Kato, I get the impression that the strings have more width and fullness to them, not because of the frequency response, not like a mid-bass fullness, but like a fullness of the quality of hearing the entire string, if that makes any sense. Where on the Salnotes Zero, it sounds maybe a little bit more narrow and a little bit more focused on the clarity of the instrument, but not necessarily the full body. And again, very, very slight, but I get the perception that that's the difference I hear in the Kato. However, the Kato, while it sounds more maybe round and full, sounds a little bit more lush, whereas the Zero sounds a little bit more clear and open in the high end. I don't want to say bright or harsh because it's not. It's just more, maybe there's more air to the sound, so the strings might have a little bit more air and a little bit more of that slight precision in the upper treble. So they're pros and cons. There really are. If you listen to a song by The Midnight called Loved by You off their new album, it has a pretty dense mix. It's a little bit on the dynamically compressed side at the chorus where it's all built up, but it has a kind of a nice mix of instrumentation. And on the Salnotes Zero, it really cuts into the mix and you can hear everything very clearly, and it almost literally like cuts into the mix and you can pick out things really well. The Kato is very, very discerning and you can hear a lot of separation, but the Kato gives a little bit more of a relaxed listen, like you're just kind of overall hearing the full sound from top to bottom, left to right, back to front. It's just kind of a gentle overview of the sound, whereas the Salnotes almost sounds like it's just someone took the photo and they enhanced it with sharpening. It really does sound like everything's a little bit sharper and more distinct. Is it as natural? It's hard to say. It's a slight difference, but it is perceivable. And I would say that under most circumstances with most music, I actually prefer the treble quality of the Salnotes Zero. The Kato is probably better in the sense that for some music it's a little bit more forgiving maybe, whereas the Salnotes Zero is a little more strident in its comparative quality, but they're very, very close. So I don't want to beat a dead horse and keep going over these things because I know I ramble about this stuff, but if you're with me this long, hey, I do appreciate it. You know, I'm all about the frequency response, and that is why I think the Salnotes Zero is so good. I think that there could be other technical aspects that lend to the quality of an IEM, but the predominant determination of quality for me, the major determination, is the frequency response. So that's kind of how I feel all these IEMs fall into place and how their value is. I would say in terms of price, they're probably reverse value. Again, I think the Dunu is the most expensive, but probably my least favorite, although it's got a great build and there's a lot going for it. Legacy 2 is probably my third favorite, and it is $100, so it's next in line. Truthear Zero is probably a close match with the Legacy 2, and that's $50. And then my favorite, the $25 Salnotes Zero. So kind of reverse order. In terms of pure sound quality, I would say the Salnotes Zero is my favorite, with the Truthear as a close second, tied with that Legacy as maybe a close third, and then the Dunu Vulkan. How do they compare to the Kato and the Elixir? Well, other than the Salnotes Zero, I think the Kato and the Elixir are noticeably better. I say noticeably, in their minute ways, they're noticeably perceptually better to me than the other IEMs. Compared to the Salnotes Zero, I think the Kato is an incredibly close match to the Salnotes Zero. And in fact, if you didn't tell me the price, I would think they were practically the same IEM. Whereas the Elixir has a quality to it that I love, a separation, an imaging, a smoothness. It's a very beautiful IEM. I do think the Salnotes Zero and the Kato have a little bit more of an airy precision in the upper treble. So it's kind of a trade-off. I think they're, whatever. They're very close. So those are probably my current 3 favorite IEMs, and I would wholeheartedly recommend the Salnotes Zero. I think for the price, it's an astonishing deal. If for some reason that doesn't fit your ear, it's not comfortable, or you don't like it, I think the Harman tuning of the Truthear Zero is probably a close second. It's got a very nice Harman tuning, very smooth response, and it's $50. Both of them are comfortable and lightweight as long as they fit your ear well. So that's kind of my summary of all these IEMs. I hope that matches with my review that I did with Mark, that blind shootout. I'd be curious to see how my impressions then compare to now. But I've had a lot of time, and I've got a lot of familiarity with these now. So I think that these are pretty solid impressions. And if you have any questions about them, please leave them below. I really do appreciate you guys. You know I'm all about sound quality. I'm not really into the placebo. I don't care about gold cables and fancy this and that. When it really comes to true sound quality, the best thing you can do is subscribe to this channel and like this video. But seriously, if you have any comments or questions, leave them below. And as always, I really do appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching.